All right, now let's take a look at this program.cs. If you have built console applications with C Sharp, this file should look familiar to you. So in every console application, we have a class called program with a method called main, which is the entry point to our application. ASP.NET Core applications are similar to console applications in that regard. So here in the main method, over these few lines, we're configuring and running a web server to host our application. ASP.NET Core comes with two in-process HTTP server implementations. One is Kestrel, which is cross-platform. It can run on Mac, Windows, and Linux. And the other is Web Listener, which is only for Windows. Now, Kestrel is a new web server. It doesn't have all the features of IIS or Apache. It's not very secure, but it's good enough to be used in an internal network. So if you're building an application for internal use, you can use Kestrel. But for a public-facing website, you need to put Kestrel behind IIS on Windows or Apache on Linux. Now, the explanation of details of that is beyond the scope of this course, but all I want you to take away is that Kestrel is an in-process HTTP server implementation that comes with ASP.NET Core. Now, back in the main method, here we're telling to use Kestrel. We're specifying the root of our application. We're enabling IIS integration and specifying the startup class. Finally, when we build a host, we run it. And at this point, Kestrel starts listening on port 5000 of localhost. Now let's take a look at the startup class. So with Command and P on Mac or Control and P on Windows, we can easily find a file here, startup. Now here we have two methods that are automatically called at runtime. One is configure services and the other is configure. Configure services is used for dependency injection. You should be familiar with dependency injection in Angular 2. So in Angular, if our components have dependencies that should be provided to their constructor, we register these dependencies as providers at a module. We have the exact same concept here. So in ASP.NET Core, if our controllers have dependencies that should be provided in their constructor, we need to register them here. So this method has a parameter of type iServiceCollection, which is a container for all the dependencies in our application. So here, I can register a dependency like this, services.add transient. Now don't worry about what is this method, just look at its syntax. This is a generic method with two generic parameters. The first one is an interface, like iRepository. And the second one is an implementation, like repository. With this, we're registering repository as an implementation of this interface, iRepository. And then anywhere in our application, if we have iRepository in the constructor of a class, the runtime will create an instance of the repository class and injects it into that class. So this is dependency injection. Now the second line here, add MVC, if you look at the implementation of this method, there are a bunch of statements like this. So when we call this method, it registers a bunch of interfaces and their implementation that are part of ASP.NET MVC or ASP.NET Core itself. Okay, now let's move on. Now the second method, configure. Over the first two lines here, we're configuring the logging of our application. So we add console as a log. So anytime we write something to the log, it appears on the console, right here. And this is good for development. But in a real-world application in the production environment, we want to use a persistent log. So we can add file system, database, or a remote source. We can register those logs here. Now the second line is adding a debug logger. So anytime we have debug.writeLine, it will appear in our log. Now in the rest of this method, we configure the request processing pipeline. So when a request comes in the web server, imagine it goes through a pipeline. In this pipeline, there are multiple components which we call middleware. Each middleware is like a function. It looks at the incoming request, and if it's interested in that request, it will do something with it. Otherwise, it just skips. Now, in the previous version of ASP.NET, in ASP.NET MVC 5, our request processing pipeline was fairly heavyweight, and we didn't have control over configuring this middleware. In ASP.NET Core, we can customize this request processing pipeline and add only the middleware that we need. And this way we can improve the performance of our application because CPU resources are not wasted for middleware that we don't need. Let's take a look at a few examples. So here, if you're in the development environment, and by the way, I'm going to talk about different environments in the next lecture. So if you're in the development environment, we add a couple of middleware. One is developer exception page, which renders an exception with all its details. And the other is Webpack dev middleware. So anytime we change one of our client-side files, like a CSS or JavaScript file, Webpack will automatically compile that and push the changes in the browser, so we don't even need to reload the page. This is called hot module replacement. And these two middleware are only used in the development environment. We don't want this in the production. So this way we can configure what middleware we want to have in our request processing pipeline. Here's another middleware. Use static files. With this, we'll be able to serve static files like images, style sheets, and so on. So if I comment out this line, we won't be able to serve any images or style sheets from our application. And this is a middleware that every ASP.NET application needs. And finally, the last middleware is MVC. So MVC is nothing but a middleware. When a request comes in, this middleware looks at the request, and based on our routes, it will forward it to an action in a controller. That's MVC. So when setting up this MVC middleware, we have a Lambda expression where we define our route template. And that's all about middleware. Now, for the most part, you don't really need to modify any of this stuff here. This is just boilerplate code. But I wanted you to know what middleware is and where you can configure the middleware for your application. Next, I'm going to talk about the concept of different environments, like development, staging, and production.